Welcome everyone. I'll be talking about GraphQL in the era of server components. So you probably heard about server components. You might be building front ends yourself. Maybe you're building just GraphQL APIs. So my first question to you would be, who's building their own GraphQL APIs? Most of you are. That's good. That's good. So most of you are using GraphQL API already, and they're in the GraphQL building stage and not so much just a single consumer, because that's a good thing to know here. So my name is Roy. I was at GraphQL Conf last year. I saw some of you, so that's always good. I work at IBM, where I'm helping to make some of the products easier to use for developers. I also wrote a couple of books about React, but also GraphQL, so that's why I also like to talk about server components and how this might change, because when I started to build GraphQL APIs, or when I started to use GraphQL in my React applications, some of the things I see in server components actually would have been really easy for me to use. I also create some content on YouTube, so if you like to watch videos, have a look over there. You can also see my my previous conference talks there. Most of them are either React or GraphQL or like web development in general. So before IBM, I was working at a startup called StepZen. Maybe some of you were users of us in the past. We joined IBM last year, and we brought our StepZen platform into IBM. So if you've been building GraphQL APIs with StepZen, which is a framework to declaratively build GraphQL APIs by pointing it at a data source, transforming it into a schema, and then deploying it, you can now do all these things in our new IBM platform as well. So if you want to have a look at that, make sure to use that QR code or go to the webpage to learn more about that. It's called API Connect now, or API Connect Essentials, so you can still do whatever you did before, build GraphQL APIs. It has a pretty good free tier. So if you're hoping to learn more about that, then feel free to look it up online. So before jumping in server components, has anyone tried to do React server components? A few of you did. So who has tried to do server-side rendering? And who has been doing server-side rendering without knowing they were doing server-side rendering? Because maybe that's a thing as well. And also when we look at server components later, for example, if you would be using Next.js with server components, it would server-side render by default. So a lot of these modern JavaScript frameworks, especially the ones that are React-based, they're doing server-side rendering without you giving a choice. So whether or not you like it, it will try to server-side render your application instead of going the sort of client single-page application route. So if you've been following Twitter, and I know I do, you might remember this image from I think it was last year's Next.js Conf, or maybe it was a random conference, where someone was doing a SQL query directly from a React component. So this is a bit overstated, but you can actually do this with server components. You can define a server, you can define a component, and within a component you can actually do data fetching. So if you're currently building something with React, maybe you're using a use effect or something like that, where you're doing a fetch to some HTTPS endpoint. Could be GraphQL, could be REST, or maybe you're using a GraphQL client inside your React components. You'll be able to do the same things, but then it will be server-side rendered by default. So when I look at this, and when I think about a lot of developers that I mentored or projects that I see online, if you look at this, you maybe don't need GraphQL, because if I can do a connection to my database directly from a React component, why would I need to set up a server in between? No matter if it's a GraphQL server or any other sort of HTTPS server. Because maybe I no longer need it whenever I have this statement. So funny enough, a lot of people were saying, as a reply to this tweet, you don't need GraphQL, which it's not really a GraphQL discussion. It's, do you need any HTTPS server in general kind of discussion when you talk about rendering components that are using SQL and the SQL is connected directly in your component. But still my answer would be to any question like it depends. I like this graph from Gartner this morning in one of the opening keynotes, where it said you have this cycle and everyone's really hyped about the technology, it's the best thing ever. And then suddenly there comes a drop where people say, you don't really need this, or there are better alternatives, or I used it and it's not as fancy as you might think. So when I go to Twitter and I see people saying you don't need GraphQL, I always think it really depends, because everyone has different use cases. Maybe you like a technology and that's why you're using it, or maybe it's actually a better technology for your use case. So in the case of GraphQL server components, or React server components, you can make them GraphQL server components if you want to. If you want to compare those two things, it's like comparing apples and pears. So I'm from the Netherlands, and we have a saying like you cannot compare apples and pears. I mean, they're both fruits, there are pits inside, they grow outside, they like the sun, but they're very different. So there is no easy way to compare the both of them. So if you think about GraphQL, it's an API specification. If we think about React, and especially React server components, it's a spec for rendering HTML server-side. So one really is an API specification, and the other is a spec for rendering HTML server-side. So if you look at it bluntly, you could say both are API specifications. And in a way that's true, but they serve very different needs, because one is used for, well, the things we're doing today with GraphQL, and the other is used to render a component through a server. So for this, I like to look at GraphQL's original intent. So I started to do GraphQL somewhere in 2015, 2016. I was at a hackathon in Berlin, which was pretty cool on its own. I think it was my first ever international trip that was sort of work-related. And what I did over there, I built an application that uses a map, like a Google Map kind of thing, to try and map the route of a car and trying to find more efficient routes. But for the backend, I was using something called GraphQL. And if you've been doing GraphQL for longer, then you know about this company. They were the first, or maybe one of the first, that were offering GraphQL as a service. So they had a platform where you can bring your data, and I think it was mostly JSON, but also there was some sort of database built in, and then you can expose that data as GraphQL. So that's how I started to work with GraphQL, and back then if you were doing GraphQL, you were doing it to reduce transactions between front-end and back-end. So this is probably your main use case. You have an API, and you have a front-end. Back then, probably it was a mobile app that ran on like an iPhone, I don't even know where to count, like an iPhone 4 or 6, maybe, well, probably a bit higher, but you were using a relatively old phone compared to now. It doesn't have the bandwidth we have today. Your mobile plan didn't have the bandwidth we have today. And you saw a lot of companies, and that's probably why it started at a social media company, that were trying to reduce the amount of traffic and the number of transactions between those front-end and back-end. So it's transactions, but also the amount of data, because data was costly back then. Data still is costly today, but far from what it was back then. You can still think of GraphQL. It could also be beneficial if you're trying to save the climate, because even though your phone is really fast, all the data that's going back and forth is leading up to processing power on your phone, but also on servers somewhere. So we have reducing number of transactions, reducing amount of data, and then most of all, I think GraphQL to reuse APIs and data across multiple teams or multiple applications or departments. Doesn't really matter how far you want to scale things. So when to use GraphQL really depends on your use case. If we think about use case A and B, like I said, I don't think there's much need for GraphQL to reduce the number of transactions between front-end and back-end, because unless you're a company with the scale of Facebook or maybe Netflix, you don't really care about these transactions anymore, because data is, well, it feels like it's free, even though it isn't, and phones are quick, televisions are quick, computers are quick. So I don't really care about reducing the number of transactions as long as the speed to the user is fast enough for them not to start calling your customer support. So reducing transactions between front-end and back-end, it's still a valid use case for GraphQL, but it shouldn't be a reason for you to start adopting GraphQL. Same as for reducing amount of data transferred between front-end and back-end. A lot of customers probably don't care as long as it feels fast. They don't feel that a lot of data is going back and forth. So if we think about C, it makes a lot of sense to still use GraphQL, even though we don't really care about data or number of transactions anymore. So I want to zoom in a bit on using GraphQL for APIs and data across multiple teams. Because when to use GraphQL really depends on your use case. So was someone at GraphQL Conf last year? I know I was there. A few of you are. There was one of the opening keynotes where I think the talk was called something like the right size for GraphQL. And that also helps you in defining, do I need GraphQL and how do I compare it to things like server components, and especially to newcomers in a community, helps them to figure out, is server components a solution to my problem? Is GraphQL even a solution to my problem? Or what should I do to get a better developer experience? So if you have this one-on-one side where you have one API and one front end, it probably doesn't make much sense to use GraphQL unless you, well, like myself and hopefully many of you, you really like GraphQL, or you found a way to get GraphQL out of the box. So if you're using a CMS or using a platform, that makes it really easy for you to use GraphQL. It makes total sense to use GraphQL in this sort of one-on-one mapping. If you're doing end-to-one mapping, where you have one API that's using maybe multiple data sources, but it's connected to multiple apps, then it also makes sense to use GraphQL because you need to reuse this data. You don't want to build new data structures for each of those applications. And you don't want to normalize, combine, and filter data in all these different front ends. At least that's what I think. But if you look at server components, some people might say differently. So if you're doing this and you're trying to render data in 3 different places, you need to normalize data, you need to do all the things I said in the previous slide. And with GraphQL, this sort of comes out of the box for you. So if you're not using GraphQL, but you are in this situation, it would be a good time to look at GraphQL because you need to process things 3 times. So as we all know, or most of we know, GraphQL solves this problem for us because it gives us one unified way to connect with all these different data sources. And especially when you use federations, I'm a big fan of federation ever since it was introduced at schema stitching, and then at a GraphQL conference in Europe, they introduced GraphQL Federation, which was pretty good back then already, and hopefully with all the changes announced this morning, it will be even better in the future. So when you're using GraphQL in a federated way, you're using GraphQL as your BFF, because you have one schema that solves all these different use cases, and all the combining of data will be handled on the sort of back-end side of things. So if you're building GraphQL APIs, you're concerned with all of this. If you're building front ends, you don't really care because you have a single entry point to your data. So every front end can reuse this data from a single endpoint, and this is really something that GraphQL will give you, where it acts like a single BFF. So if you know this meme about SpongeBob, you might think BFF is best friend forever, but it's backend for front end for those that aren't aware. So backend for front ends are still quite popular, but they were really popular like when GraphQL was introduced, because people ran into the issue where they wanted to reuse APIs across multiple front ends. So this made a lot of sense in 2012 when people came up with GraphQL. But still today, because I'm still seeing companies building backends for front ends. And even if you think about it, if you think what server components do, and I'm seeing this happening already, people are using server components as their backend for front end. So a backend for front end is an API layer to help you take data from multiple data sources and normalize them for your specific need. This also means that you can combine data from multiple APIs and then have a single interface for your app. So server components can be used as BFFs for different APIs. So if we look at this slide, you can see here that you have an API. So this could be any API that someone in your company creates and you want to integrate in your front-end apps. If you are building one of those apps, you might be better off like using a React server component, taking the data, normalizing it specifically for your use case. Because as the person building this app, you best know what to expect from your data. You best know how to put it in a format that actually makes sense for you to use. And each of these different apps can build their own backend for front end. Because if it's as easy as in your component doing an API call, transforming the data, and rendering it, you might be better off doing it this way rather than setting up a whole system of federated GraphQL APIs. And sometimes I see people trying to use React Server Components as their single API. Maybe you're an indie hacker, or maybe you're working on a side project. You don't want to set up an entire API infrastructure if there's something like React Server Components. Is any of you using Next.js or Remix, for example? Okay, that's good. Yeah, so if you're using those, you probably used API routes or the loader pattern. So this is quite similar to React Server Components. All you have some sort of API definition in your application, and from there you're doing API requests, you're putting data in a format that you can pass it on as props to your components. So if you're an indie hacker, you can actually use this as your single API. So there would be no need for you to set up a server, which could be GraphQL or REST. There would be no need for you to set up some sort of HTTPS instance where you make sure data is passed on efficiently. So this really helps people building small projects, or it really helps people that need to work with infrastructure that isn't GraphQL. So one question I get there is, so what other upsides does GraphQL offer app developers? Because we already walked through situations where GraphQL is really good at helping you reduce the number of transactions, helping you reduce the number of data being transferred, which aren't that valid anymore because people assume data is sort of free. And then we saw you can even use React Server Components as your BFF if you want to, whereas I still prefer to use GraphQL for those kind of things. So as an app developer, there's more ways to get value out of GraphQL. And this is through GraphQL clients. People sometimes forget that the GraphQL ecosystem is more than building federated APIs or than turning data sources into GraphQL or doing caching or doing any other sort of things we like to do with GraphQL. It's not all server-side. A lot of the things people enjoy in working with GraphQL also happens on the client side. And there's multiple ways to use GraphQL as a client, of course. You can use Apollo client or Urkel or GraphQL hooks, or you can use React Query or 10-stack query, which is how it's called today. Or if you really want to get the benefits of GraphQL, you can use Relay. And if you're using Relay, and if you probably saw one of the earlier talks this morning, which was really a deep dive on how Relay helps you to build modern and faster front ends. So when you would need Relay is, and this was still valid if you're building React Server Components. Let's assume you have a component which is a list of products, which then renders a couple of products, which are components on their own. And then the components, which you call product, they have their own subcomponents where data might reside. If you're doing this with React Server Components, you still need to think about where do I send a request and how I'm going to funnel data from one place to the other. Because prop drilling, which is what it's called if you're passing props from like the top component to the lowest component in this tree, is something you want to avoid at all costs because it gets confusing at some point. You can see like 3 layers of components here, but we all know like a real use case is probably more like 10 layers of components, and sometimes even components that don't really know they're being used in specific ways. So if you have something like this and you're using GraphQL without something like Relay, you need to figure out where am I going to do the data request. So where would my request to retrieve products come from? The sort of natural way would be to send a query with this operation where you retrieve a field called products. It has all sorts of fields under it. And then you would take the top level field products, you look what other fields are in there, and you pass them down as props. So this is what I mentioned as prop drilling. And as you can see, this gets confusing because we now have 3 layers. Maybe you have 5 layers, maybe you have 6 layers. And it wouldn't matter if you're rendering this server side or client side, or you were just drawing it out as a picture like this. It gets confusing anytime. So if you have this situation, you're probably a bit smarter than me, and you're doing state management, right? Because you want to send your data, send your request to the GraphQL API, collect the data, put it in state management, and then maybe your props can find a smart way to retrieve this data from state management. So this is already better than doing prop drilling, but you still don't get the maximum amount of value you would want to get, because now you're just doing the GraphQL request somewhere central, and then the components are picking the data they need from this central location. So this is typically what state management does, and it works well for any API, even for GraphQL in here as well. But as I mentioned like a few minutes ago, there's better ways to do this, and Relay is one of the ways to do it better. And this is all done via a compiler. So if you think about Relay, you have your different components. Each of the components needs a subset of the fields that you retrieve via your GraphQL request, and these are then defined as fragments. So each sort of component will have a fragment of data that they would need. So the Relay compiler will then help you to compile this into a query, and then, well, not really in a query, more an operation, and then send this off to your GraphQL API. And this will then be added to a data store, and then the components can read from this data store, but based on the fragments. So this is already easier than when you think about prop drilling. You get all the data at your top component, pass it down, or you get all the data from a central place, which is your state management, and then you have each component pick it. This is where each component has a fragment, and then the combination of all fragments will be used as your operation, and then these fragments again will be used to find the data that was retrieved by your API. So when you're using server components with GraphQL and something like this, you'll get real superpowers, because you get the best of both worlds. You have components that use server-side render, and then these components are picking data in an efficient way from all of your GraphQL. So another thing that you can do with GraphQL, which is still valid in the world of server components, is generating TypeScript types from your schema. As someone that really likes TypeScript, this is something I use every day. I really like to have an API specification for my API. If I would be doing server components without an API that has an API schema, I would still end up in situations where I'm not really sure what data I can expect, how the data would compile into types, and if I'm changing something in the API, how it will affect the component that I render. So generating types is still a very valid use case of GraphQL. It's not the only use case. I've given a talk before about how GraphQL compares to tRPC, for example. So if your only use case is to use GraphQL to generate types, then you might be better off looking at tRPC. So the use case where GraphQL is good in helping you to collect data from different sources, turning it into subgraphs, federating those subgraphs, and having a single data layer for all your apps still makes sense. And then TypeScript is something you get on top. It shouldn't be the reason for you to pick GraphQL. So does using GraphQL in your app without Relay make sense? I think it does if you are using this many-to-many distribution in terms of apps and data sources you're trying to combine, or number of teams working on your APIs that need to use that same API. But if you're not using the data reusability, it shouldn't be your only reason to pick GraphQL again. So I think GraphQL to me really is the combined story of having all these federated subgraphs, about having clients like Relay to help you efficiently request data from your APIs, and then server components are something you get when you're using the React ecosystem. So another reason why I really like GraphQL, and I've been using GraphQL, like I said, since 2016. And the past few years we've all been building, well, we might have not been building AI, but we've been using AI. And something I noticed, and probably more of you noticed, is the way a GraphQL schema is defined is really easy for us to read as people, but it's also really easy for natural language programs to read. So an AI system like an LLM, it can look at your schema and then help you to answer questions based on that schema. So before our company StepSign was acquired by IBM, we had a feature in our Explorer. So we are using the graphical libraries there to have a playground that people could use, so like a graphical embedded in our dashboard. And we also added a feature there which we called something like talk to your schema. So what we did, we would take a GraphQL schema, as you can see here, and then instead of having the user write a query or an operation where they say, I want to have the fields transaction and order and products, and for products I want title. You can also type a question like, when will my package arrive? Or give me a list of all employees. And then the LLMs will be able, based on your GraphQL schema, based on what it knows about the GraphQL spec, you can even insert parts of the GraphQL spec, and then have it create the GraphQL operation for you that you can then execute to get the, well, in this case, the package of a user. So this is something that's quite cool because the declarative approach of GraphQL and the ease of use of the schema doesn't only fit us or fits the compilers that we're using to compile things to TypeScript or to render data with libraries like Relay. It also helps large language models to guide us through the process of building and consuming GraphQL APIs. So we're building something new in this space here as well, so feel free to check it out. We're basically using GraphQL and the power of turning data sources into GraphQL into an API schema and then connecting it to LLMs. So this is pretty cool. You don't need this tool to do it. Like I said, GraphQL schemas are understood by most LLMs, especially those that are trained on code. And if you have LLMs that are capable of doing function calling, it gets even better. It does require some prompt engineering, so we're trying to make it a bit easier for everyone, but I would really recommend you to try it out on your own GraphQL APIs. So to recap, I don't think you should compare React Server Components and GraphQL one-to-one, like some people on Twitter did. I would say there's an upside on combining the two of them. And I would also say React Server Components are really good for people that want to bring their front ends closer to their data. Whereas GraphQL, in my opinion, is moving away from the principle and it's bringing your data closer to other data and teams building on top of this data, and not so much bringing data closer to applications. So GraphQL is really good for data reusability, and I would advise everyone to break their data into subgraphs if your company is big enough, or you have different use cases for your APIs. And the declarative language is something that really excites me in this world where we're starting to move towards AI, and AI helping us to make better decisions, but also AI helping us to make our lives a little bit easier. And then React Server Components are really for rendering server-side HTML, whereas GraphQL is for building APIs. So we shouldn't compare them, but if you're an indie hacker, React Server Components might be a good substitute. So that was it. I think I have some time for Q&A, but I want to thank you all for bearing with me. So do we have any questions? If not, that's fine. I'll be around most of the day, so feel free to catch me in the hallway. Oh, we have one question.
Yeah, you said you were talking about React Server Components and that you would sort of still need to hoist your data dependencies higher up in the tree in order to have efficient data fetching. But I was curious, is that not similar to this data fetching you have in GraphQL, where each resolver is individually fetching data from the database? It seems that, I'm curious, like, does that seem functionally different than each component reaching out and trying to talk to the database?
Well, it depends. So my assumption, generally speaking, is that the person consuming the GraphQL API doesn't know where all the bits and pieces come from. So as a front-end developer, I'm sending an operation with like 5 fields, and some of them might be nested. I don't necessarily know if it's one call to a SQL database, or it's 2 calls to a REST API, or if it's, I don't know, static JSON being returned somewhere. So it's kind of hard to figure out how that would work. So when you have server components, I think ideally, and I've been playing with this, you still want to break up your server component that's being rendered and being shown, which is like the top level component. You still break it up in multiple components. If those multiple components are doing separate API requests, then you still have 3 or 4 requests happening, but then server side. If they're doing a single GraphQL request, and you don't really know what's happening in there, if it's doing multiple API requests or just one, then at least to me as the consumer, I'm doing one API call. So it's a bit hard to, well, it's a bit hard to compare.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all.